Hello, a lot of you know me as Griffith, and most of you know me to be an awfully weird person, but there's something about me I feel I have to come out about that I haven't really told anybody else. It feels like how I personally assumed the LGBT community would have been viewed back in the days during the Stonewall protests, and though we are making slow and steady progress with the LGBT community, there's one letter that I believe is missing unjustly, and that letter is the letter N. For those of you who don't know, necrophilia is the act of having sex or having sexual attraction towards the body of a person who is deceased. It is something my fellow brothers and sisters have been struggling to come out about for a while due to lack of others' acceptance of who we are. We're afraid of being beaten up and maybe even lynched for being ourselves. We can't control the way we've been born. Now that I've said my piece and my stance on the situation, I think it's time for me to justify why necrosexualities should be added to the alphabet soup from a non-religious perspective. The first argument I hear the most is about consent. Since we live in a time in which there are people who believe that there's a rape culture out there to fight against, it would be one of the more controversial points. The main argument that pro-necrophiles are in support of is that corpses cannot give consent against sexual relations, to which bigots respond that the corpses cannot give consent, which means that it is rape. The problem with this is that corpses are incapable of feelings and should not be given the same rights or respect as the living. Since we are under the presumption that there are no souls or powers beyond to dictate punishment for the one-sided stimulation of necrophilia, meaning that a dead body is nothing but an object in a clump of cells, and as a result it should not be treated as though it's a human life. If you're not against objects such as fleshlights, onaholes, dildos, butt plugs, Hitachis, and other things used for sexual pleasure, then you must concede that the use of corpses for the same purpose is not immoral. Otherwise, your opinions are inconsistent and should be disregarded. Another argument to this is that the dead had requests before they die, and we should respect those. Ignoring the object argument, this is a bit of a concern, but it neglects to mention that we do things to corpses that they do not consent to prior. For example, not everyone knows what the process of embalming a corpse entails. Not everyone consents to which coffin they want to be buried in. Not everyone chooses the clothing they want to be buried in, and the list goes on. Some people would argue that only the family of the deceased would know what their desires are, and therefore, anything that should happen to their family member's corpse should be under their supervision. However, for the sake of argument, let's say, hypothetically, Jada Smith were to die. Now, Jada Smith has been very vocal about her open relationship, which we should all lovingly support. However, her husband, Will Smith, doesn't seem to have as positive a reception to it. If the wishes of her family go against the wishes of herself, as in this scenario, then you cannot argue that the family of the deceased should have control over this corpse's autonomy, sexual or otherwise. Nothing is capable of perceiving anyone's true perceptions or desires. Therefore, the only solution to this in society is to accept everybody for all their flaws because we cannot assume that they have bad intentions. The worst we can assume from them is that they have trauma in their childhood and they're trying to cope with it in some way. And who are we to stop them? The last and most genuinely critical argument against necrophilia is that necrophilia is considered vandalization of private property. For starters, one has to agree with the fact that private property is a right, and since graveyards charge money for headstones and lots, the means of production should not be in the hands of the public. This means that one cannot argue this point of necrophilia while still being an atheist communist and sympathetic to the socialist cause. If you want to argue from the perspective of a capitalist atheist, one already consents to the vandalization of a corpse when they decide to leave without any measures against decomposition. And on top of that, cemeteries do not ensure the chastity of the corpse. The only service they provide is digging a hole and placing a headstone with a name in front of it. Now, one can argue that undigging that hole is against this service. However, we would have to be under the assumption that the necrophiles put the dirt back in the hole after opening up the coffin, which is something completely illogical and against the rational thinking of the necrophile, due to the ease of access to the corpse being cut off. Now, one of the most obvious arguments is that necrophilia is illegal in every state. And while that is true, so is pornography and homosexual sex and marriage. And it is absolutely astonishing to see that we have progressed so much into sexual liberation, acceptance, and tolerance. As Karl Popper described, in order to maintain a tolerant society, the society must be intolerant of intolerance. So what's the real harm in adding an N to the list of letters we have so far? Bigot?